Hello everyone and welcome again. This is Miss Mokwa with another Wellington High School AICE Psychology audio lecture PowerPoint. We're going to be moving on today to our final study in the cognitive unit, which is Laney. So students, as per usual, if you would like to take notes, write down anything of interest or value to you. Of course, write down any questions you'd like to ask me or any clarifications that you would like for the content. Also, if you would like to complete those PowerPoint questions early, please do so. Go right ahead. And if you need anything, please let me know. And with that, we are going to get started. So Laney is a really interesting study. It really embraces a unique concept, and that concept is false memory. The idea that the human memory is not perfect, far from it actually. It's fallible, it makes mistakes all the time. And we can even manipulate the memory. We can plant memories. The focus of this PowerPoint is going to be on planting a false memory. Now, in the past, research in this topic has been based on memories that are neutral or negative. That is ethically questionable. The idea that we could implant a memory that was negative or traumatic could really harm someone's mental health in the long term, and it's really not an ethical thing to do to manipulate someone's mind state, especially with something that didn't even happen. So we are looking for ways, and Laney is looking for ways, to study false memory in a more positive light, thinking about the concept of reprogramming oneself and changing your behavior in the now. So we are going to take this concept of false memory, see if we can apply it, and if Laney is correct, we would be able to change someone's food preferences based on a false memory that we implanted about their childhood preferences. So by manipulating a participant's thought about their childhood food preferences, we could change their food preferences in the now. Okay, so moving on to our background now. Background. False memory, of course, just to define it for you, is a memory that did not actually occur in the person's life. Now, one of the tricks that psychiatrists, psychologists, and anyone working in the false memory arena can use is details. So a false memory could have a lot of true details. For example, if you spent your summers at a certain summer camp, or if you had a summer home in a certain location, or if a certain person was your best friend between a range of ages. So details can be used that are real, but the main element of the memory did not occur. So for example, a false memory that could be implanted is seeing Bugs Bunny at Disneyland. It's impossible. He's not a Disney character. You wouldn't have seen him in a Disneyland park. But maybe you had visited Disneyland parks before when you were a young child. Maybe someone described a lot of details that seemed specific and seemed really realistic to your life experience. So there are many ways to kind of implant a false memory by surrounding it with context and details that make sense. Another thing we need to understand is that we tend to view the memory as a concrete, unchangeable thing, concept, that I remember it this way, so that is exactly how it must have been. This actually isn't true at all. Memory is not static. It's actually incredibly changeable. It's very, very easy to manipulate, and it's constantly being edited by what's happening around it. So if you would want a modern equivalent, that would be something like a Wikipedia page, constantly changing and updating based on the circumstances, who is editing it, for example. Now, this kind of Wikipedia page of the mind, if you want to go on that journey with me, can be edited by people, information, time, and direct manipulation. So for the quiz, we should know how we think of the mind and the concept of the Wikipedia page and the ways in which it can be edited or manipulated. It's also important to understand that memories can be fragmented pretty easily. So even though we think of memories in this concept of them being incredibly concrete, they are stable, they are static, they are what they are, they're usually pretty flawed and actually can be completely incorrect in certain circumstances. So the memory is not this strong, concrete, unchangeable thing. The memory is actually very easy to manipulate under the right circumstances. moving on with some more background. The metaphor or the image I like to imagine is the idea of filling in gaps. It's very interesting how the memory works. We can, of course, store a lot of information, but with false memory, we're taking some real information and we're taking a false event at the core. So the core of it is a false event, and there are some realistic information, realistic bits that fill in the gaps. That's how this works. So as I said, the image or the metaphor I like to present is like building a home, like blueprints. It's a framework. So in the framework, at the core of it, you have a false memory, a false event that did not happen. But around that false memory and false event, the blueprints, the outside of it, the framework is all realistic information that happened in your life. So a date, a time, like I said, a certain summer camp maybe you used to visit, a friend that you had, an item of clothing, something specific, something that really relates to you. And the brain will naturally kind of fill in the gaps and embed this information. So the brain will get creative. It has a starting point. It has the false memory that's been implanted. It has realistic details that were kind of sprinkled in the false memory to make it more believable or real. And then the brain is very plastic. It has a sense of creativity to it. So kind of on its own, it will creatively fill in the gaps and create a narrative, create a story. And that's how a false memory truly gets implanted and the person will believe it. Now, I have a video that I'm going to show you in class about this that actually shows an incredible psychologist. Her name is Julia Shaw, and she's really an innovator in this field. She plants a false memory in a group of people, and she shows how the mind kind of manipulates you in a way that you don't expect, that when you are presented with certain information, if it seems like it's factual, if it seems like it's something that makes sense, you will believe it even if it didn't actually happen to you. So I'll give you guys some really, really good examples of this, and I'll show this happening. Just like the example I gave before, it is possible to implant a false memory. It is possible to implant something that is impossible, that did not happen, that could not happen. It's not physically possible. So this effect is so strong that you can take something that is unrealistic, cannot happen, and convince yourself, the mind can convince you that it actually happened. The example I gave before is here again, meeting Bugs Bunny at Disneyland. Now here's where things get interesting. I would highlight this part as well, the white text on this slide. False memories can even influence present behavior. That is really what Laney is trying to look into. Can I implant a false memory about someone's childhood food preferences? And if they accept and believe that false memory, will they like that food that I implanted that they liked as a child? They think they liked this food as a child. Will they like it more now? Will they like it more in the now? Will they eat more of it in the now? Will they view this food in a more positive light because they now believe that as a child, they used to like it? Okay? That is the most broken down, simplest way to explain what Laney is about. We implant a false memory, we see how it affects you in the present and how the person, the participant, is going to behave based on the implantation of that false memory. Now, we can actually even do this to the point of making someone physically feel ill. You can make someone physically feel ill if you tie a psychological concept to that feeling. So if we look in the middle of the slide here, individuals who had false memories implanted of sickness when eating a certain food, pickles and eggs, actively avoided that food in the present. So if we planted a false memory that when I was a child, I hated pickles and they used to make me nauseous, and if the person believes that false memory in the present, they will actively avoid eating pickles in the present, even if they used to eat them before this experiment happened. So it's incredible how we can really do a 180. We can change someone's behavior based on a false memory that didn't even happen. This is our foundational research. This is the basis of which Laney grew her experiment on. So some of this foundational research was already there with the pickles and the eggs, for example. We knew that planting impossible false memories does work, but Laney is going to take this and move it in a more positive direction and really look into and discover what she can about food preference and see how food preference will change over time based on false memory. Okay, everyone, we should be on slide 8. Slide 8. Laney has 2 aims, and they are very layered. They're quite thick, and there's a lot to look at here. So why don't we take a moment, read aim 1 and aim 2, and then I'll break these down for you a little bit further. All right, so let's kind of dissect aim 1 and aim 2. Aim 1, and I would write this on the slide somewhere, mark it, annotate it, highlight it, put it somewhere on the slide, that aim 1 is just essentially saying they want to implant the false memory. They want to implant a false memory that as a child, a participant loved to eat asparagus. That is the food memory we're going to be manipulating, asparagus, the vegetable. Okay, so aim 1 is just part 1 of the experiment. We want to implement this false memory. We want to implant it and see if the person believes it. That's the goal. So aim 1 is all about implanting this false memory that as a child, the participant loved to eat asparagus. If we look at aim 2, that is more about what's happening in the now. So aim 2 takes aim 1 and just goes a step further. So aim 2 says, after this has happened, so let's assume that the false memory has been accepted as fact. So the person now believes that they loved asparagus as a child. So if they believe that, in the present, in the now, will the very sight of asparagus be more appealing to them? So if they were looking at a menu, or if they had a PowerPoint slideshow with a bunch of different foods, would they rate asparagus more highly as more appealing than they did before the experiment, before the false memory was implanted? So do they now view asparagus in a more positive light? Do they find it more appealing because their memory has been manipulated? So that is aim 1, that is aim 2. They are complementary. Aim 1 comes first, aim 2 comes second, of course. And just like Andrade, if you remember Andrade a little bit back, the first study in the cognitive unit, because there are 2 aims, there has to be 2 procedures. There has to be 2 parts to the procedure. So because we are testing 2 aims, you will see the procedure in this is significantly longer. But remember to mentally separate or segment those. We've got aim 1, procedure 1, aim 2, procedure 2. Okay, everybody, I've got a great extra credit opportunity for you. We will be going over this in class as well, but if you are listening to this lecture, you can, of course, get it done early if you'd like to, so you can turn it in early if you want to get ahead on your work. Now, here's what we're going to do for the extra credit. Referencing aims 1 and aims 2 that we just covered, I'd like 1 page, it can be written, it can be typed, doesn't matter, on if these hypotheses are confirmed. So let's assume for now that Laney is right, that you can implant false memories about food preference, and if you do so, that person will be more, find the food more appealing in the present and be more attracted to that food in the present. If that's the case, how can we take these findings, these results, and help others? So how can we take the ability to manipulate food preference and use it to someone's advantage? Now, the neurotransmitters that activate when we eat, for example, a sugary food like a donut or a very fatty food like, bacon at breakfast, the same neurotransmitters activate as if we were having synthetic or drugs outside the body, drugs that are addictive. So even though this is about food preference, you could also reference things like addiction, food addiction, or chemical addiction in your answer. So in your answer, I'd like for you to talk about how, if these findings are true, if aim 1 and aim 2 are confirmed, how can we then use this knowledge to help people in the context of healthy diet, if they had a food addiction, if they had a chemical addiction, how are we going to reprogram them and help them if they had an issue with food, okay? Or if they had an issue with addiction. So take that, work with it however you'd like. If you have questions, ask me. I'd like one page on that topic. Now, the one page can be typed. It can be on notebook paper. Please just make sure you have your name, period, and date. And that's going to be single space, not double space. So just regular old 12-point font, Times New Roman. Keep the formatting very basic. And remember, if you have any questions, please feel free to come by and see me during lunch. You can ask me anything you'd like in class, or you can always shoot me an email. Okay, so as I said, there are 2 aims of this experiment. So of course, there has to be 2 experimental procedures to address those 2 aims. They're going to be separated. They'll be segmented. Of course, aim 1 gets addressed first, and aim 2 gets addressed second. So let's start with aim 1. Aim 1 is looking at if we can implant the false memory for loving asparagus. So how are we going to do that? The first step for Laney in the aim 1 procedure, you could say study 1 or aim 1. If you look at the very bottom here, I have Laney methodology and design study 1. So you could say study 1, you could say aim 1, doesn't matter. The first thing Laney is going to do, use questionnaires. Now we see deception here, right in the white. So we see deception. Please highlight, star, underline, or mark deception. We are going to use deception, which means we have to do a debriefing later on. So let's talk about our participants for this aim 1 part of the experiment, aim 1 or study 1. We recruited them. 128 undergrads, University of California. They are getting course credit for participating, so we would call that an incentive, okay? That's the incentives we always talk about. If you're going to be part of a study, you have to get something for your time. So the course credit is the incentive in this case. I would highlight or mark significant skew female. We have another gender skew in our sample. This is not good. We've talked about in our previous videos why a gender skew in either direction is a bad thing, about how it doesn't represent the population at large, and that makes the diversity of the sample and the size of the sample not so great. You really need to have a sample that represents the larger community, and because we have a 51-49 split for gender, that's what we want to go for. We want to go for 50-50 when we can get it. In this case, however, the skew is very significant. We have nearly 100 females and only 30 males. So it's not even close. It's very important to understand how this gender skew could affect the data. Our mean age for the participants was 20.8 years old. We could say 21. This makes sense, of course. We're on a college campus, so it really makes sense that we would find that kind of age range. We also have the assignment of the participants here. So random assignment, please highlight, mark, underline, or annotate for random assignment. So the participants are randomly assigned to either the love group or the control group. As we said previously, this is an independent measures or independent groups design. So that means random assignment could be like the flip of a coin. You know, heads means active group and tails means control group. So in this case, random assignment, it's a wonderful way to sort your groups because it gets rid of any bias you might have. It's completely at random, and that's how we're going to split our groups here. The active group is the love group, the love asparagus or the love group. The control or baseline group is the other group. Continuing with study 1 on slide 10, we are working in a lab experiment. Of course, that's an artificial environment, not at all like everyday life. That means we're going to have low ecological validity. The participants were tested in groups, which is unique. They were tested in groups of up to 8, so they were not always tested alone. The group size could vary. Let's take a moment to look at our IV and DV. The IV, to break it down for you and make it even simpler, is just the implantation of the false memory. Either you had the false memory of loving asparagus implanted or you didn't. So if you were in the active or love group of course, you had the false memory of loving asparagus implanted. If you're in the control or baseline group, you do not have the false memory of loving asparagus as a child implanted. And we're going to explain how that's going to be very, very sneakily snuck in. The false memory is going to be implanted in a very interesting and sneaky way in the procedure. So we'll go over that. And the DV for AIM 1 or Study 1 are the results of the 5 questionnaires. Now, we're going to go over those questionnaires in depth. Some of them were actually used in the data, some of them weren't. They're what we call distractors. So I'd write down, put a star, a little note that some of the questionnaires were not actually used in the data. They were called distractors. But we have to remember, and we covered this in our intro week, that certain types of experimentation are more valid than others, certain types of report. And what we're going to be using for questionnaires is self-report. That means someone telling you about themselves, their likes, their dislikes, factual information like height and weight. That's all self-report. But that is a huge issue. If a lot of our data is based on self-report, people may have biases. They may fall into what we talked about previously, which is demand characteristics. By nature, people don't like to reveal things about themselves that make them uncomfortable. You may not want to admit on this food questionnaire that your favorite food as a little kid was chicken nuggets and sour straws or Twizzlers. You may feel a little embarrassed that you ate junk food all day as a kid and your favorite snack was barbecue Lay's chips instead of saying that you loved apples. So self-report, though very useful and very cost-effective, isn't always the best, because if the participants get embarrassed or they don't want to share an answer, they will fall into demand characteristics and kind of just tell the experimenters what they want to hear. So we have to be very careful when we use a lot of self-report. Okay, so let's talk about these 5 questionnaires. We should all be on slide 11. Slide 11 questionnaires. So there are 5 questionnaires used in the study. They all have specific purposes. We are going to go over that in class. So we're actually at this point going to do a group activity in class. We may have already done it depending on when you view this video. And you guys are going to go over the 5 different questionnaires that are part of AIM 1 Experiment 1. You have to know what it's called and what it's for. So what it's called, what it's for, what is it trying to measure. Of course, everyone's going to have their own paper. I have no problem. We're going to be working in groups, but that does not mean we all copy. We know that. So we're not going to be copying, but you guys can collaborate. I'll be walking around the classroom. I'll be helping you. So make sure we know these 5 questionnaires. Take a moment now, look this over, and then we'll move on after we've completed that activity. Okay, questionnaires. There are 5. The food history inventory, the restaurant questionnaire, the food preference questionnaire, the food costs questionnaire, and the memory of belief questionnaire. Okay? So these 5 questionnaires are given to all the participants, and it's a way to get a lot of data about their food preferences. Now, you'll notice that 2 of the questionnaires are in bold and 3 of them are not. And this is a big, important thing we need to write down. Please note this somewhere on the slide. That the only data that is deeply relevant to the study and experiment are the FHI and the RQ. So the food history inventory and the restaurant questionnaire. The other 3 are what I mentioned before that are called distractors. We don't want the participants to figure out that they're going to have a false memory implanted, right? So if they figure out the deception, the whole experiment's over. It's not valid anymore. It wouldn't work. So because of that, we need to throw a ton of information at them. We need to throw a ton of questionnaires and questions at them so they can't figure out what our true purpose is. So that's what I meant when I said we use deception, and Laney got a little bit sneaky. The idea is that if we ask people all these food questions, they may not figure out that we're going to be implanting a false memory related to food. So remember, even though we have 5 questionnaires, the 2 that are valid and are actually being used in the study when it comes to data and results are the food history inventory and the restaurant questionnaire. That may be on your quiz, so please take note of it. jumping into procedure. Now, this is the simplified procedure for AIM 1 or Study 1. Remember, the entire point of AIM 1, Study 1 is to implant the false memory and have the person believe it. Okay, so take a moment, look this one over. I've done it once again in a bullet point format style so that it's like a checklist. Think of it like a list, and you just move through steps 1, 2, 3, 4, move it on through. Okay, this can be a little bit tricky, so stay with me. Look at this one for a moment, and then I'll jump in with you. Okay, so let's take a look here at the procedure. If we go to bullet number 2, the participants were told the experiment would be about personality and food preference. Let's highlight that or mark that. That is part of the deception. That is part of the deception. They were not told the true nature of the experiment. Why? Because if they were told about what was really happening, the experiment would not work. It couldn't move forward. You had to use deception to get organic, natural results that were not based on demand characteristics. If our sample falls into demand characteristics, we fail. So as experimenters and as scientists and psychologists, if your sample falls into demand characteristics, your validity is at 0, your study has no merit, and you kind of fail. So that's why in this case we have to use deception. Okay, so they get there, they are told it's about personality and food preference. They fill out these 5 questionnaires. We've talked about which ones are the real ones and which ones are the distractors, and that's it. 1 week passes, so we've got a 1 week time increment between this step and the next set of steps. Take a look at this one for me, please. Okay, so now a week has passed. We imagine that a week has passed. The participants are coming back into the lab, and they are randomly placed in the love asparagus group, the active group, or the control group. Now here's where these 2 groups divide. So make a star, make a line. I would do a big break in the page. So I would separate bullet 1 from bullet 2. That is where our sample really gets split up into active group or control group. So I would personally just make a big dark line between bullet 1 and bullet 2 to segment those. So now they've been split into groups. Active group is in one spot and the control group is in another spot. Now, they are both given a report on their food preferences. You'll see that's in little quotes. Why? Because it's all fake. Okay? These fake reports are manipulated based on which group the person is in. So if you are in the control group, you get a very boring report that is very basic in nature and really could apply to any kid. Okay? So if we go down to the very bottom, participants in the control group only received 3 filler sentences about sweets, fried foods, and spinach. So those phrases are in the book. Make sure you know those phrases, but every person who's in the control group gets the same report that says they liked things like sweets, fried foods, and they occasionally ate spinach. Things that would be true of most children. I don't know a young child that does not like sweets or fried foods especially. So a very generic, boring report that has nothing surprising. Now here's where it gets interesting. If you were placed in the active group, if someone is in the active group, their report has this line in it. As a child, you love to eat cooked asparagus. So boom, that's our false memory. There it is. The false memory that you loved asparagus as a child is snuck in that report. This multi-page report about your food preferences, they snuck this one line, this little line in if you were in the active group. And if you read it, assuming the rest of it was true, which it was, they got information about people's food preferences from family and friends. So as I said in the very beginning, you know how I made the reference about blueprints and how you can use real life details to influence the mind and make a false memory more believable? That's exactly what Laney did here. So Laney used friends and family to give true information of people who were in the active group they got friends and family, and they asked them what that person liked as a child. So the rest of it is going to read like it's true, because it is. If I was in the active group and they asked my mom what I loved to eat as a child, I guarantee you the first thing she would say is pasta. Chris loved to eat pasta, which was absolutely true. We used to have pasta every Sunday. So they got true information from family and friends to make this report really authentic. And then they slipped this one little line in about the asparagus to implant that false memory. Can you imagine how believable that would be? If everything else in it is true, and you're in your 20s, maybe you don't remember every single moment of your childhood, it's pretty convincing that you get this very complex report, and you'd probably believe this line about the asparagus. So that's how it's done. Then to follow up, in the procedure for study 1, now we get some separate information. Okay? Participants are asked 2 specific questions, one about the setting of the experiment and the other about their experience overall. So this is more of a questionnaire about, like, how did you feel during the experiment? Were you comfortable? Was the setting comfortable? The lights, the seating, and so on. So that's some separate information. But here's where it gets really important. They fill out the FHI, Food History Inventory, and the RQ a second time, the restaurant questionnaire. This is super key, so please highlight or mark this. Why would you do that? Comparison. The people who are in the active group, we have to see if they rate asparagus differently now. Are they going to rate asparagus as more delicious or appetizing or positive because they had the false memory implanted? Okay? Will their rating of asparagus go up because they read that little sneaky line in their personal food report that they got from the experimenters? Okay? That is the crux of the entire study. That moment where they take the FHI and the RQ again is where we're going to get the vast majority of the data that we compare from the first time they filled those out to after they've been deceived, and will their mind and their opinions change about asparagus. Now, after this happens, of course, we use deception, so we must what? Debrief, okay? If you deceive, you must debrief. We already talked about why. There are legal reasons, there are ethical reasons, so we already know what that entails. They're told the true nature of the experiment. They were told that their family members helped. They were told that the asparagus false memory was a lie, and they are sent on their way. Okay, so that is the entire procedure for AIM 1 or Study 1. I need you guys to mentally separate Study in AIM 1 with Study 2 and AIM 2. So that is now over. We finished AIM 1. We're going to move on now to AIM number 2. Remember, AIM number 2 is different. So almost think of this in a way as 2 separate studies in one. Don't mix them, don't mesh them. They are different and they're measuring different things. Even though it's still about food preference, those 2 aims were significantly different. So please keep in mind, this is now experiment procedure 2 for study 2 for AIM number 2. Take a moment and give that a look over. Okay, everyone, we should be on slide 16, procedure of study 2. Here's where we are going to take what we had in AIM 1, and we are going to expand upon it. Okay? We already implanted the false memory. Now we want to see if just the sight of asparagus is more appealing to the participants. Okay? If that false memory has been implanted. Okay? If a false memory has been implanted, can someone's perception of that food change just by the sight of it? So by seeing a picture of asparagus, will someone who's had this false memory implanted, will they like it more? Would they be more excited about it? Would they be more willing to eat it, for example? So will they find a picture of asparagus more appealing based on a false memory that didn't even happen? Okay, once again, looking at IVs and DVs. IV, whether the participant had the false memory of loving asparagus embedded or implanted. DV, questionnaire results and the participants' responses to the picture slideshow of 20 common foods. Please highlight or mark picture slideshow of 20 common foods. That is the big difference in aim number 2. This is a visual test to see if people find the image of asparagus more attractive after the implantation of this false memory of childhood loving of that food. Understand at this point, we have a completely new sample. Completely new sample. Nobody who was in study 1 is part of study 2. Nobody who was tested on aim 1 is going to be tested in aim 2. Even though we're taking this further, you have to remember that everyone from study 1 was debriefed and sent on their way. So this is another experiment that's going to do something similar and then take it further, but there's no crossover in the participants or the sample. So if someone was in study 1 or tested for aim 1, they would not be in this group being tested for aim 2. So make a note of that somewhere. There is no crossover. If you were in the first study for aim 1, there is no way you can be in the second study for aim 2. New sample, new group of people. We are still going to use the independent groups design, meaning that once you're placed in a group, you stay in that group. We have 103 participants from the University of Washington. They also got course credit in exchange for participation. That is their incentive. Once again, guys, here it is, female gender skew. And it's so funny that we see this across so many different studies. I don't know if that's because the college campuses have more females on the campus. Maybe more of them want the extra credit. I couldn't tell you the reason, but in a lot of our studies that are on college campuses, we have significant female gender skews. So please highlight or mark the 64 females, 39 males. You don't have to know the number per se, but you should know that there is a significant female gender skew in this study. And you'll notice the mean age is a little bit younger than study 1. The mean age here is 19.9 years, about 20. I think the mean age for study 1 was about 21. So we've got a little bit of a younger sample here. All right, we've got another surprise coming up. We've got some more extra credit. I like to give quite a bit of extra credit in the first semester of the course while you guys are getting used to everything. I know quite a few of you are sophomores who have not taken AICE classes before, and I understand that the rigor of these AICE courses, especially the way I format my course, that it would feel like an intro to college course, a freshman year of college psychology course, can be tough to adjust, especially if you haven't taken higher level classes before, anything AICE or AP or IB. So I'm going to give you guys some extra credit today. As usual, you can do this in groups or individually, but of course, if you do it in groups, your work must be original and organic. It cannot be copied in any way. If it is, you will receive a 0, but you guys already know that, so it shouldn't be a problem. What I'd like you to do now is take out your soft text. If you're doing this at home, of course, you can borrow a copy, or I can give you the online link so you can find the book that way. If you're in class, we'll do it together, and you'll be outlining the procedure and the results of study 2. Okay, so let's complete your notes that way. Instead of me giving you the procedure, I'd like for you to do it yourself. I would like it in a format very similar to the one I've given you a few slides back for AIM 1 or Study 1. So please do it in a very logical, stepwise motion with bullet points. I do not want paragraphs. No paragraphs, no giant, don't write it like a novel. No giant long thing. I'd like it to be to the point and very focused so that anyone who's reading it could replicate it themselves. So make sure you do have all the steps, but you don't want to add any superfluous detail. So once you're done outlining, feel free to move to the next slide. Okay, we are now on slide 20, conclusions. Turns out Laney was right. False memories, implanting them, it does work. And it does have real-world consequences. So people who believe the false memory, we can also call that false feedback or false information, they rate the pictures of asparagus as more appetizing and less disgusting. Okay? So even if, as was the case here, every single person who was in the active group, every single person who was in the love asparagus group, before the experiment started, they had, based on their initial questionnaires, a neutral feeling toward asparagus. We can't have some people who already love it, some people who hate it, some people who feel really nothing about it. We need to have our entire sample who is in the active group have a neutral feeling toward asparagus. Okay? So anyone who had a neutral feeling toward asparagus, who was in the active group, they rated the pictures of asparagus as more appetizing and less disgusting. So everything really was confirmed. The false memory does get implanted, and then that implantation changes people's behavior in the present. If you want to think of it in a more logical manner, like an equation, you have a primer and then you have a change in processing. Because remember, we're in the cognitive unit. It's our last study in the cognitive unit, and this is all about how information is processed in the brain. So the false memory or the false belief is the primer, and then the image is processed more positively. That refers more to aim 2. So if you look at the little visual I made for you toward the middle of the slide, the false belief implanted, the primer, leads to the participant seeing the food more positively. The false association with childhood, so believing that you love that food as a child, leads to a feeling of warmth, a feeling of happiness, of liking that food, which is the adult preference. So false association with childhood, adult preference. It's incredible to think that a false memory, something that didn't even happen, can change someone's attitudes in the present and their behavior. Their feelings and attitudes, even their memories about that food, asparagus, change. Okay, strengths and weaknesses. We always have these. Strengths, lab experiment. We got a ton of data from this experiment. It's easily obtained because questionnaires and self-report measures are very low cost. We can give them to a lot of people at once. They don't take a lot of time or a lot of money to do. They're not very specialized. There's no special equipment. It's just usually paper and pen or paper and pencil. But for the weaknesses, as we said, questionnaires don't always reflect people's actual behavior. It's a self-report measure, and that means we could have demand characteristics. So as much as we would hope people are honest all the time, we know that can't always be the case. We have to be very careful that not too much of our data comes solely from self-report measures, because people are human and they'll fall into demand characteristics if they're afraid, for example, that they'd be judged by their food preferences, or that they would feel uncomfortable with someone knowing what they really like to eat. Another issue we had, and I would highlight this one as well as demand characteristics, so just take a moment and highlight demand characteristics and no long-term follow-up, is no long-term follow-up. That's another issue. The idea that this change has occurred is pretty powerful. The idea that you can change someone's food preferences in the present by implanting a false memory about the past, pretty incredible. But we haven't answered the question, how long does that change last for? Is it permanent? Is it forever? Is it for 5 minutes or a week or a month or a year? How long will the participant, how long will the person feel this change? How long will they believe the false memory? How long will they view asparagus in a more positive manner? So we don't know if this is a permanent effect or if it is not a permanent effect. Will it kind of wear off over time? You know, maybe the biology of the way that person is wired, they really just don't like that food. Even if in the short term they liked it more, maybe that could change over time. So we really need to look into a long-term follow-up here. Lastly, we have student participants. That could be a confounding variable. Students, especially if they were in medical science or psychology, may talk to one another about food preferences. Of course, in college, there's a lot of pizza, there's a lot of junk food in that kind of environment. So if people knew each other, for example, if I was a psychology student at one of those college campuses and my friend was too, if we were both placed in the control group and we both got that very boring neutral report about food preferences, and I called her and I went, hey, I got my results from that experiment that we did. And she goes, oh, me too. And we read them off. If we both figured out that our stuff was the same, our results, our, customized report that ended up being fake, if we both figured out that that was fake and we figured that out during the experiment somehow, that could be a confounding variable. We don't know people's pre-existing relationships. We don't know how they relate to one another. They could be friends, they could be dating, they could know each other really well and know things about what kind of foods their friends like. Siblings even, if siblings were on a college campus and they both were in the experiment, one is in the love asparagus group, the active group, one is in the control group, and they know each other really well, they'd be like, wow, this is really odd, something isn't adding up. So that confounding variable could be an issue. Moving on to slide 22, this is ethics, ethical issues, which we should always address as part of the AS curriculum. Really, really important. And I want to have a discussion about this in class because I find it fascinating. We always talked about, when we were covering the intro to psychology, when we first started this class, about how important ethics are. And just because we can do something doesn't always mean we should. Actually, most of the time, just because you can means you shouldn't. So we have to understand and consider the consequences to our actions. Even though we're doing this in the context of science, can we hurt someone emotionally, mentally, physically, any of those things? Is it morally excusable to mess with someone's memory? I mean, if you strip away all the other parts of this experiment, even though it might be for a good reason, you're learning a lot about memory and how it works, is it right to manipulate someone's thoughts like that? Even though they're being debriefed, is it okay to manipulate something that's so personal and sacred and private as somebody's mind, as their memories? So that's a very touchy subject, and it's not something that is done easily. Remember, the APA, the American Psychological Association, governs what research is done, what is approved, and what is not approved. And of course, they have to weigh the scales to say, is this experiment worth the risk, or ethically, is it sound? So we have to keep in mind here that even though this may seem positive, that it's a silly, fun thing about food preference, the implications of this study could be very, very major. The idea that you can manipulate someone's memory and their mind could be used for negative purposes. So even if it's for a good reason, we have to take into consideration how it would affect people long term and how they would feel if you were in that debriefing room and you were told that your memories were manipulated and that you actually didn't like that food as a child, you might feel very uncomfortable. So even if it could help someone, for example, kick a junk food habit, or help them like more fruits and veggies instead of things like chips and pork rinds, is it worth it? So we need to discuss that as a group together, and we're going to do so at some point in this chapter, probably through Socratic seminar. Just wanted to include this because it's a gorgeous graphic, and B, I love George Orwell. So go ahead and take a look at this quote and consider it. I'm not sure if this is from Animal Farm or 1984. I'm pretty sure it's from his novel 1984. Which I have a copy of in the class library if you'd like to borrow it. Moving toward the end of our PowerPoint now, let's go over our Big Five. Of our Big Five, 3 issues are key: application to everyday life, individual versus situational explanations, and nature versus nurture. So let's start with application to everyday life. As we said, it could change people's behavior, their food preferences in the now. It really could make them more healthy if we used it in the right way. So that's a consideration. Individual and situational explanations. As we said, everyone is different. Not everyone likes the same foods. Some people love strawberries, some people hate them. Some people love asparagus, some people hate it. So we had to make sure that the people in the active group, they were placed in that group and had a neutral feeling toward asparagus, not a negative feeling, not a positive feeling. We had to start with individuals who had a neutral feeling. Remember, individual and situational explanations take into account if the way the situation is being perceived is based on the individual, their personal thoughts, feelings, and perspective, or the pressure of the situation, the environment, and the context kind of taking over. So in this case, we need to consider individuals and what kind of foods they like, and also how people were pressured and how their minds changed due to the report, and how the line in the report about asparagus changed their perception of that food. Lastly, we have nature versus nurture. This is a very fascinating debate we'll be talking about in class as well. Are food preferences hardwired? There is some research that states that while your mother was pregnant, if she liked certain foods, like things that were salty or things that were savory, you may also be hardwired or programmed to prefer those certain foods. That's what it means when it says in utero exposure. That means while you are in the womb. So while you are in the uterus, let's say, for example, your mom loved nachos. She loved those nachos. So she had those all the time while she was expecting. Now you, as the fetus in this scenario, have the placenta connecting the mother and you. So anything that she eats, you're also consuming. So because of that, maybe fetuses are hardwired from that time to have a preference for certain chemical compounds. We're not exactly sure quite yet, but it's very interesting research that I'd like to delve into with you a little bit more. But if we look at the nurture side of that argument, so much of food is cultural and ethnic. It really is a reflection of where we come from. As someone who's Sicilian American, there are some recipes and some things that I had with my mother that she would make that I really couldn't find anywhere else. Certain pastries and baked goods, especially during the holidays, that were from that culture that I couldn't imagine myself not growing up and eating. So part of it is definitely nurture. What we're exposed to, what our parents cook for us, the culture of how we viewed food and eating, and the social nature of dinners and what would happen when we ate. So there's definitely some debate there. There's definitely some nature, there's definitely some nurture. Both of them are going to play into what foods we like and why we eat what we eat. We could always argue that Laney has proved that food preference is not as set in stone as we once thought. So food preference is a little bit more flexible. It can change based on our cognitions, based on our tastes and preferences. So it may not be as concrete as we once believed, just like with the memory. You know, if you hated a certain food for a really long time, let's say tomatoes, let's say you just did not like tomatoes, that could possibly change if your mental processing, your memory was manipulated, or something else in your life changed. So it's a really interesting concept that these things that we thought were once so static and concrete and unchangeable are actually quite changeable. Okay, and with that, everybody, we have hit our PowerPoint questions, our homework. Once again, for directions, these are going to be on your quiz. Your quiz is written answer. We have, of course, the question number, we have the AO number, and then we have the point value of the question. You're going to be working with point values of 2, 3, and 4 here. So let's take a look at them. Remember, these questions are due a few days before the quiz so that we can go over them together. You'll get all the right answers, and you can use that to study. Please take a moment to highlight question 9, AO3, question 9, AO3 about Dr. Brown. So please highlight question 9, AO3, Dr. Brown. This is a very unique example that represents something you'll see on the AICE exam about being creative and taking what you've learned and applying it to something new. So these questions you may not be familiar with, and I would like to go over these with you a little bit deeper in class. So if you need any help with those or you'd like to go over them some more, I want to just briefly touch on those with you. So please highlight question 9. You can also highlight 10, 11, and 12 if you'd like to, but since this line of inquiry starts on question 9, we're just going to start there. Okay, everyone, that is everything. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation on Laney, the final cognitive study in the unit. This is Miss Mokwa, AICE Psychology, Wellington High School, wishing you a wonderful day. Thank you so much for your time.